In this video, I'll be philosophizing on languageability as it pertains to distinctions within the personality characteristics constituting the overarching subcomponents most associated with the personality characteristics of reasonability and/or diction and/or epistemic thinking. Each are meaningful to engage the verbal and/or nonverbal communication of certain meaningful utterances of thought that are meaningful to engage meaningful communications and/or satisfy certain essential and/or necessitated underlying psychological needs relevant to one's language communications within meaningful utterances of thought as one is navigating the meaning of certain meaningful utterances of thought. Diction is most related to the correct pronunciation and or spelling of certain meaningful utterances of thought, including the appropriate practical combinations within compound complete sentences and or paragraphs, meaning certain analytic terms may hold distinct meanings within the unique combinations within the complete sentence and or paragraph that is also meaningful to infer the intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties within the clearest communications of certain verbal and or non-verbal meaningful utterances of thought that are appropriate to engage more meaningful relationships and or meaningful communications, satisfying often certain essential and or necessitated underlying psychological needs within the communication, as well as often preventing and or mitigating conflicts, and is also often meaningful for engaging what truly cultivates more meaningfulness within valued communications. Again, preventing and or mitigating conflicts, yet is also more meaningful for clarifying what one means, and is more about also the desire to seek out clarity in situations one may be uncertain of what another means. So diction is not always about one's own desires to communicate clearly, though this is mostly what diction is related to. It is also related to the desire to clarify communications within the communication in order to appropriately respond to the needs unique to the valued communication. And this is associated with languageability, as one is able to infer certain areas of vagueness within the communication. It's related to reasonability. And reasonability is mostly associated, this is the situations where an individual may infer within another individual's perhaps inappropriate, yet in most cases more likely accidental mistake in terms of the mistaken pronunciation and or may conflate a single term that may mean some other term, yet one may more reasonably infer what that individual means, that is more related to creative problem solving within communications and or being able to identify the soundness within valid communications, engaging more reasonability. You may be questioning, well, Bruno, aren't you the individual whom is always going on about ration and thinking more rationally? Well, this is true. Reasonability is more universalizable, and when we're thinking about personality characteristics, most individuals approach more valid and or the soundness within meaningful utterances of thought within reason, not rationality that's more exclusive to individuals whom are uniquely more intellectual and who necessitate the self-conducted learning to engage ration as a practice that is distinct from more intrinsic, inherited personality characteristics. Reasonability is mostly inherited compared to rationality that's mostly necessitated in terms of learning. One needs to engage certain self-conducted learning in order to cultivate rationality as a self-committed practice, and that is mostly about engaging self-disciplining within certain volitions and or conducts. That engages certainly languageability. It is mostly proportionate in one's judging of what's meaningful in terms of certain evidential truth claims. Reasonability is more related to inferring the valid communications and or one's ability to composition complex communications to reason within communications. The opposite polarity being nonsensicality, individuals who may have more difficulty making sense compared to individuals whom are high in reasonability, who tend to be able to make sense comprehensively and whom are able to comprehend most communications, even in terms of vagueness, and may often help other individuals fill in gaps in meaningful information in order to clarify communications. And so, as meaningfully related to the other videos I have recorded on personality characteristics, you should see similarities that are connecting within the overarching subcomponent personality characteristics, meaningful reciprocal relations within the intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties that hold together the overarching personality characteristic, in this case languageability. There's a meaningful positive relationship within diction that is associated with the clarity and or reasonability, inferring certain gaps in meaningful information as one is being able to seek out clarification and or derive from the inferences one is engaging more complex creative problem solving to solve more meaningfully, that benefits from epistemic thinking, that is most related to the inferences into the origins within the etymologic origin of each vocab, with a distinct theory of knowledge, each etymologically complex vocabulation within certain correct and or appropriate syntax within complete sentences and or paragraphs of communication pertain to distinctions within vocabs, that individuals may engage in some situations the more creative thinking to connect distinct epistemological appropriate etymologic combinations that derive origins holding unique, meaningful similarities to, in some cases, originally instantiate original and or new and or different directly and or indirectly related associative analytic meaning interpretations that provide more comprehensive meaning epistemologies within the originality of one's thinking. Yet this needs to hold certain relevant and or appropriate and or meaningful connections to the actual factual probabilistic etymological origin in order to be appropriately received by the interpreter. Meaning that what tends to make language work is the most approximate, accurate correctness of one's definition associated with the etymologic origin of each vocab. Improving one's comprehension and or communications within the more congruent inferences that connect directly and or indirectly related associative analytic meaning interpretations to the appropriate and or relevant and or meaningful utterances of thought as one is engaging meaningful communications. Each are meaningful to satisfy certain essential and or necessitated underlying psychological needs, within self-preferential evaluations, engaging mostly verbal communications, yet are more meaningfully combined with nonverbal communications that are most meaningful to increase the translucency within communication to others. So you may optimize your comprehension with the appropriate calibratory nonverbal communications, as other individuals, the interpreters, are mostly inferring the meanings from nonverbal communications. Most communication is nonverbal, not necessarily always verbal. Yet verbal communications is the most meaningful to clarify and or uniquely communicate complexity. Impossible to communicate nonverbally. Nonverbal communications are most meaningful for communicating more vaguer, yet in many cases urgent, demanding, essential, and or in some cases necessitated underlying psychological needs, most related to threat and or certain concerns that individuals may have, compared to verbalizing certain communications that allow us to engage more compassionate and or complex creative problem solving, that allow us to infer the unique subjectivity of another individual, and which connect being to another being in terms of more comprehensive, meaningful utterances of thought that in other analytic terms may not otherwise truly hold an existentia outside the self, had one not held the appropriate calibratory languageability to infer the syntactic structuring of complete sentences and or paragraphs of meaningful utterances of thought that one communicates, the libraries of one's prior existing complex meaningful utterances of thought within introspections one roams and navigates within the more awesome, meaningful awesomenesses of self-exploratory mind wanderings into the unknown unknowns to satisfy the necessary conditions to optimize healthy psychological functioning and or positive subjective well-being, with more optimal reasonability in terms of navigating what's more likely to elicit probabilistically the creative problem solving that optimizes intracategorical and or intercategorical effectivenesses and or efficiencies within engaging the executive functioning, future-oriented, evaluating the risks and or benefits, increasing dopamine to approach what is more likely to satisfy certain essential and or necessitated underlying psychological needs within the appropriate disallowances to avoid the harms that are counterproductive and more likely to result in abnormalities within the dopaminergic activations of one's future-oriented processing, engaging the executive functioning with more meaningful cultivations within the limbic system from engaging top-down processing instead of bottom-up processing that's more related to sensory influences upon one's subjectivity instead of the causations one elicits from the self-engaging introspections that influence direct perception of certain sensory processes that one may optimize with optimizing the intracategorical and or intercategorical effectivenesses and or efficiencies, engaging creative problem solving to need less time and or engage less costly expenditures to optimize the benefits one experiences within engaging more the appropriate calibratory languageability, reflecting one's intellect. That's all I want to say for this video. Hope you have an awesome one. Keep moving after that.